Hello and welcome. Today's video is aimed mostly at people who are just starting out with the idea of making and sculpting your own miniatures to be 3D printed. You know what I mean. 3D printed miniatures, whether with the classic plastic spools and fused deposition modeling like this one was, or the more high-end resin printing kits. You can get some amazing results with the current technology. But specifically what we're going to be talking about today is posing your figure. Now, in the people who do the actual physical sculpting with putty, most often they will use a maquette. Now, by a maquette or dolly or armature, I mean something like that. What this is pewter, actually, and very often companies will have their own specific armatures so that all of the miniatures made by the sculptors in their company have the same rough basic proportions, they're the same size, that sort of thing. Now, I did something similar digitally, and it's something you can do as well. It just takes a bit more work and a bit more setup time, but it saves a tremendous amount of time on the back end. And that's making your own digital armature or maquette. Specifically for me, it's this. Right down here. What this is, I made the basic geometry in 3D Studio Max. I then brought it into DAZ Studio and rigged it and set it up with bones. Now, what I mean by bones, you can see here. These are not actually geometry, but what they are is they tell the computer where the pivot point is, and that's the small point, and where the major axis of rotation are. The long axis being its twist, and then you've got a bend and a side-to-side axis where the other two planes are. Now, one advantage to this is I can save poses I like. And since it's poses we're talking about, that's a good thing. Now, one thing to consider is that there are two primary rules when dealing with making poses. The first one is about making a pose seem natural, making it seem realistic. Now, there is a plane that is where the shoulders are. It's like a plane. There's one where the hips are. These planes, when you make your pose, should never be, it should always be off somehow. They should never be perfectly parallel to each other and to the ground, because that will end up making your character look stiff, look like a marionette, that sort of thing. So, I have, as I said, made a few basic poses I can show you to show you what I mean, but that's going to be after I explain about the next stage. Actually, no, we can go ahead and show them now. A basic standing pose for this figure is this. Now, he looks mostly stiff because that plane of the shoulders and that plane of the hips are still parallel to each other and they're parallel to the ground. If you're not making a figure of a character that is in a perfect United States Marine Corps stand at attention pose, this is unnatural. A more natural stance, even though he's holding a fist up, would be this. Now notice that his shoulders are kind of tilted, his hips are rotated slightly forward, and his chest is rotated slightly back. That's a more natural pose. The next thing we're going to talk about is balance. If a pose is supposed to be dynamic, and the character is supposed to be leaning forward or otherwise moving, you need to have the figure appear to be off balance. And by that I mean the part that's touching the ground does not go under the center of gravity, which for most miniatures, like for most humans, is right around just a little bit above, like an inch or so above where your belt buckle is. So we have a bad version of a run pose here. Now, looking at it from the front doesn't look too bad. Looks like a lot of, 1960s comic books. But when we go to the side, it doesn't look like he's running. It looks like he's standing balanced on one foot. There's nothing dynamic about it. It's static. There's no motion. On the other hand, if we switch to something that looks like a 90s comic book, here we go. Yes, this would actually be harder to print, and it's a bit exaggerated. But you see what I mean? It's heavily off balance, which leads that line of motion to be following his, the direction that he would be falling if he was, not moving. It feels dynamic. It feels like he's moving very fast. You can have a static pose with a dynamic feel, but he's still not moving anywhere. It is a natural pose. You see what I mean about the hips and the shoulders. It's very exaggerated, but they're not parallel to each other. Those two things, balance, if it's balanced, it's a static pose. If it's unbalanced, it's a dynamic pose. Neither one is wrong. But if you're trying to make a dynamic pose, you don't want him balanced and static. And again, this is exaggerated. Most people understand that. At the very least, what you could do is you could take that leg, bend it forward a little bit. It's not quite balanced. It's not quite as dynamic because he's ending his motion, but it's still got some movement, a bit more than it did before. So those are the two biggest things. Now, when you figure out what you want your pose to be, one good option is to stand up and take that pose. Pay attention to how your hip bone itself rotates and pivots. Pay attention to how your collars are moving and not just don't attribute everything to the shoulder. Reaching around across your body, your collar moves forward a lot. That'll also help if you move. Make sure to have collar motion. Going back to our buddy here, I pointed out when I had bones, he has collars. These collars go forward and back, not just the arm at the shoulder. So, standing up and taking the pose that you want your figure to have makes it a lot easier to realize what joints you want to bend where. And there's some aspects that you really can't exactly replicate in the miniature maquette, but when it comes time to sculpt, you can affect those. For example, on your typical human being, you take your arm, you bend the arm, partially extended, the bicep is thinner overall, but it's thicker on the ends. When you make the muscle, it kind of does a little kink. The ends aren't quite as thick, but the center is a lot thicker. That's something that most forms of rigging have difficulty simulating. But when it comes time to sculpt, you can just tweak the size of the muscles, tweak the bony protuberances of the hand. They're more likely to be visible in a fist than they are in a flat hand. you can, that's things to take care of in the final sculpting phase. So, to summarize, number 1, the hips and shoulders never perfectly parallel. Just a few degrees is enough to make a standing pose feel natural. Number 2, action poses are off balance. Static poses are balanced. And I'd like to thank you for joining me. And since this is not being broadcast, I'd like to ask that you hit that subscribe button, and hit the notify bell, blah blah blah. If you really liked the video, like it. If you didn't, don't worry about it. I'm not as concerned as some people. But anyway, I am going to go ahead and say thank you and goodbye.